The negotiated project is a project where you get to explore your own ideas, look at sort of critical theory, and there's a huge diverse range of strands you can go off into. So it's a really great opportunity to have kind of period of time where you're dedicating it to sort of your own personal research, and every student has their own personal approach, and it's aimed at sort of developing us as artists.
Great. So you actually did the part written, part practical. Can you tell us a bit about the subject that you looked at, what your research was about?
Yeah, well, it was about I had this sort of need to explore a relationship that I saw, which was, or I kind of had come over the 3 years to find, which was borders and boundaries that existed both in landscapes and cityscapes, but also I saw kind of quite clear links to the borders, for example, in gender and in race and class. So that's sort of was the starting point for my project, but it did develop a lot over the process. Yeah.
And how long was that process?
It was about six months.
Okay.
But then we had time before where we were doing a lot of background reading, broadening our knowledge in the area of the subject that we wanted to focus in. But yeah, we had about 6 months, and that included the writing of the essay, and for those who chose it, the practical elements, which in my case was installation.
Okay.
And this book.
Excellent. Do you want to look at the book? Shall we just have a look through?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite... so the book is my dissertation, essentially. It's the written work. But I thought, I felt that it was really important and integral to the project, that the writing is seen in context to the images that I'm looking at and making.
How many words was that essay?
It was, I think, 4,000 words.
Okay.
And then if you did whole written, I think it was 8,000.
Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, if you want to have a look, this is so my project was called Map Lines, Border Zones, Gender, and that was quite in this first image. It's quite. Oh, this one as well. This is the lines taken from patterns. So the patterns used to make clothing.
Okay.
And here I've got a map with, and I'm looking at borders on maps are laid down as concrete, but the fact is they don't work that way in reality. And I talk a lot about the border zones, theorists have argued that these border zones have sort of begun to increase.
Okay.
So the place where people are standing, Judith Butler, I think, says standing at a point where you're at two places at once, is increasing, and that's through things like travel is possible, easily accessible, contacting people through the internet is a major effect. Here I've got maps. This is a very early map, and I talk a lot about the nature of maps as always having a slant, a particular worldview, and this is a very early map of Babylon.
Right. And
Babylon is in the centre of the map, so it's quite clear the important thing for that map was Babylon.
So how did you choose the maps that you've used within the essay, and also I believe you used some within the installation as well? How did you select those?
I think for very different reasons. In the essay they were kind of clear case studies that other theorists have looked at, and found kind of quite clear examples of where maps are misleading or convey a kind of quite obvious slant, bias. This is some of my work on patterns, and I'm marking out these areas which in this case I'm calling the border zones. They're zones where there's kind of room for flexibility. There's kind of no man's land. There's many people exist in these areas, but they don't actually exist on paper.
Okay.
Here's the Berlin Wall, which is another case study I looked at, and I was really inspired by the situationists, and particularly this notion of the derive, which is where you go into a city, and your object is just to allow the city to tell you what way to take.
You're guided almost.
So you're guided, so you're allowing the city to tell you which direction.
And do you look at that in relation to gender?
Definitely.
Okay.
The buildings are sort of historical. They leave traces of ideas or notions of how people should behave. I talk a lot about spaces. Architecture comes with its own set of rules. So that's why there's this kind of big attraction of ruins, because they're spaces which have lost their rules. And they're kind of in between spaces, spaces that have the police function no longer exists, which is something that Foucault talks a lot about. This is Regent Street, which I really like this example because it affects anyone who lives in London and has been there. And this was built essentially to prevent the access into Soho. To be very difficult.
Okay.
And when walking down there, it's actually quite tricky to get into Soho, and you'll find it's often quite a narrow path, and that's kind of a quite obvious way that cities
to put you off.
Yeah.
So that's to do with the separation of classes?
Yeah, that's, in that case it was separation of classes. But I talk a lot about spaces being gendered. So, I mean, for example,
I can see here there's the front of a female changing room at the school.
Yeah. And I did an experiment actually where I put on a performance in the women's changing room and one in the men's.
Oh, right.
And it was part 1, part 2, so it was a piece that continued in the other changing room. And it was interesting, people's response.
So did the audience go from one changing room to the other? Or did you find that some people didn't?
It was set up in a way that people weren't controlled,
Okay.
but they were self-controlled because they knew they were spaces. So, for example, in the women's changing room, I think only one man went in to watch the performance. And interestingly, in the men's changing room, quite a few women went in.
Okay.
But again, it was there was a kind of something that was kind of tapped into from the responses I got. There was a kind of people felt very strongly about this divided space.
So that performance that you've just described, was that part of the research that you did as part of the negotiated project, or was that a previous performance that you'd done?
No, that was directly for this project. And, and that was actually one of the first things I did as my practical work.
Okay.
Later on, I developed my practical work more as a kind of biography. I was looking much more at how in the studio I can talk about myself and these objects which I brought in, which were maps, patterns for dressmaking and fabric, different sort of materials.
So in terms of the installation that you mentioned, do you just want to talk us through, I noticed in the back here there's some pictures from the installation. Do you want to just talk about what that installation was, like physically, what it had in it?
It was
You created a garment, is that right?
I created several garments which I pinned maps and I transferred bits of text. So they became sort of like maps that sort of went between looking at physical location and also the location of yourself. And I was quite interested in this idea of wearing a map and where that could take me. This particular page is looking at seams, exploring seams as the in-between spaces, the border zones. So leaving garments with just the seams behind, cutting out the, I guess where countries, continents would be placed.
So how many garments did you actually make?
Well, there's lots of, like this one isn't really a garment, it's just seeing how the waste from making
the pattern cutting.
So the patterns have been taken away in this tracing paper, and I'm left with just what's behind, which is something I looked a lot at when, previous to this, I went to an art foundation course.
Okay.
So it's drawing a lot on that work. I'll see if I have some photos. This was one of the things.
Oh wow.
Which was, this was the sort of end performance I chose to do in the end, which was, I had my friends who would come into the studio and choose some clothes to get into, and then they would find a position, often lying on the floor, and I would cut the clothes off, and that was it. And the clothes here are left on the floor, and as the exhibition unfolded, more and more garments would be left in the space, and they sort of leave that. I really was interested in how they're left on the floor as artifacts, no longer worn clothes.
This picture's quite interesting, isn't it, where you can see her like lifting up and away from the garments and leaving them behind.
Yeah, there's a kind of there's lots of things that could be read into it, and it's kind of leaving behind something of yourself, and also in this last one, the kind of the object becomes useless. It becomes a shell of what it used to be.
Yeah.
Let's see if I've got some. And here we've got some of them left behind. And this is a film I did. Yeah, and here brings me quite nicely to these books, which these again were maps. They've got quite. I'm really interested in origami.
Oh right, that's very complicated, isn't it?
So I'm quite interested in how you can fold objects away, and it kind of contain traces of memory. Like this is a place that I was born in, but I only remember. I was only there for 3 years.
Oh right.
So.
And you've got
I have
here
a vague
this place memory. I think I remember.
Yeah.
Okay.
And as you unfold it, it becomes fragmented.
Yes.
Let's see if there are any other sort of hidden. That's the place I remember much more of.
Did you live there?
Okay. For most of my life, and here I have a map of Stockholm, which is where my mum's from.
Oh right. So there's a slightly autobiographical element of this part.
Definitely. And I've left the markings, or actually I've drawn them back on to the fabric. Markings that say, well here, women's sleeve, size 8.
Okay.
And
long seam.
And bias.
Yeah.
For if you're cutting on the bias. Things that kind of told the history of the object. And we read these symbols like women's sleeve all the time, but we're not aware that we're reading them. Is my is where my research is, really.
And what inspired you to look at this as a project? Was it something that you'd always thought about? Was it something that came out of a module? at the school, or?
Yeah, it was really, I think, doing cultural studies at a school was really helpful. It brought up lots of different people who were exploring similar things, and in our first year we write an essay.
Okay.
And that's quite nice because I think it's really important to develop the ideas.
Mm-hmm.
So for some people they chose very different things to what they studied in their final year.
Right.
But for me it was a very clear development. I felt different focuses, but there was a kind of strand that I started in first year,
right,
and then went on in second year, and then my second year essay was really the kind of introduction to all the ideas that I then explore in my negotiated project. So yeah, it was the academic work that we did beforehand that really allowed me to explore at the level that I really wanted to explore it in.
So was it almost as if you sort of got the tools to be able to do that through the earlier essay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And you write one in second year, and there are other essays that have more of a scientific slant that I think you do in your second year as well.
Right.
So it was really varied how the subjects people chose. So some people took quite scientific approaches, some were writing very much about dance, and then people like me who were doing more sort of theoretical based stuff, which to me related completely to the work I was doing in dance, but perhaps didn't talk about dance directly. There were kind of issues.
And how do you feel that this has helped sort of either inform you or helped you evolve as an artist going forward? Is this something that you think you'll continue to look at, do you think?
Yeah, definitely. It's been really important to do this project because I've had the kind of that luxury of a designated time period where you really get to focus on things that you're really interested in, and that's great. I think that's really important. And I loved the process. I mean, it was hard work, but you really gain a lot from doing it.
Okay.
And this will definitely feed into the work that I'm doing now, and hopefully after.
I think.
Would you like to see the dress?
Oh yes, that would be exciting.
So this is at the heart of the book.
Do you want to put it down flat? Is that helpful?
Yeah.
Okay.
And
Shall I open?
It's a garment, basically, which can be worn. And when you have it the other way,
Oh right.
like this,
Oh.
the book
It's
acts as the front.
Oh.
So again, about wearing autobiography, wearing the map, and it's a kind of issue that
I see.
that lots of the people I looked at discuss. It's kind of need to find things like homeland and why is it important and maybe even relevant in 21st century. Yeah.
And in terms of the fabric, Did you choose that specifically for a purpose? Or?
There's something kind of quite clinical and
Yeah.
genderless about it. I wanted to make, unlike the patterns that I'd been looking at, which were very much gendered,
Right.
the way they were fitted and constructed, this is a very two-dimensional pattern which kind of bears very little gender in it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that's it. I just wanted to say thank you for talking me through all this
You're
and just
welcome.
for sharing your experience with us all. It's been a real insight into, the methodologies that you use into creating, what essentially is, the biggest piece of work that you come out with at the end of your degree.
Yeah.
It's great to get that insight and also just to understand how you got there. So
Yeah, and I think it, to know that, I think it's important to know the options you have when you come here, because I came thinking I was going to have to fight to carry out what I wanted to carry out, the research, but in fact it was the perfect playground for that, which without that support, I don't know how much I would have been able to grow as an artist.
because you mentioned that you did the foundation in fine art, and am I right in thinking that you were going to go on to art college and you decided to come here?
Yeah,
Is that right?
well, I specialised in fashion, hence all the interest in clothing. But I think there was something in the back of my head which always knew that I was interested in performance and live action. And at the end of the day, either way, I was going to do my own work.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I haven't really got a good answer to why I chose. But
You're pleased you did?
I'm pleased I did, yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Cheers.